Please welcome host of Queer Eye, Karamo Brown, and author Tara Westover.
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? There we go. Hi, friends. How are you all doing today? Good. I'm so excited to be with you all. Tara, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm extraordinary, thank you. I come from the Black Southern Church, so when we come into congregation, we like to first of all tell people to turn to your neighbor and say, good morning, I see you, I will hear you, and I love you. It's nice just to set the intention, right? I'm very excited to be sitting down with Tara right now. This is probably one of the most special moments for me. I know they said an unlikely pair, but I actually think this is pretty likely of a pair that could speak. Both of our stories are both uncommon to some degree, of how we have made it through these traumatic moments and have turned it into stories of success, of love, of empathy, of all the things that are great about this world. And I think in a time when we feel so polarized, where it seems like no one is listening to each other, when we feel like we're on different sides and no one is really hearing each other, I think what is special about this conversation that I hope that we're gonna have is that we're gonna be able to share how we use our uncommon stories in order to connect with other people who have different beliefs than us. You agree?
Sounds like an ambitious goal, but I support it.
We can do it. So the first question I have for you is your story. Does everyone know Tara's story? Oh, well, let's start there. First of all, let's start there.
Cliff notes, I guess, is I was raised by survivalists in the mountains of Idaho. My parents were opposed to a lot of institutions most people take for granted, but the big ones were the medical establishment and school. So I was never put in school. And when I was 16, I decided to educate myself. I went to university, and for 10 years, that's what I did. I went to school, I got a PhD. But because my family was a bit radical, the end result of that would be I would move more into the mainstream, and they would become more radical, and there would be a choice, essentially, that would emerge out of that, where I would have to weigh this obligation. What do I owe to my family, and what do I owe to myself? And the end result of that would be I would be estranged from some of my family. And that's not a super common story, I don't think. I mean, my family are radical. They're different. Most people here weren't raised like that. But I do think a lot of people do have to make that choice. I know you do a lot of work with LGBTQ youth, and I think that central conflict with family, what do I owe to my family? What do I owe to myself? Is something I think a lot of them face as well, and it's not for the reasons that I faced it, but it is the same choice.
Yeah. Can we all write that down? Are we taking notes? What do I owe myself, and what do I owe my family? And when I say family as well, it could also be used in the sense of what do I owe my community? What do I owe my world? Because I think that internal conflict is the first conflict that we all experience, so that we can then be in the space to connect with other people. So hearing your story, I mean, most people would have said, I'm not gonna be able to find love and empathy in having someone, love and empathy for myself, first of all, but then also still finding love and empathy for my family. How did you find a space to use your story to still connect with them and find love and empathy for them?
And I think forgiveness is something that you do not for other people. I think it's something you do for yourself. And you do it because it's not nice to live with anger. And I think anger can be good. I think it can serve a purpose. I think it can be used to get you out of situations that are harmful to you. Once you're out, though, I tend to think you can let go of it and just live a better life without it. So I try to think of anger in a kind of meta way. I try to step outside of it and say, why am I angry, and is this feeling useful to me? Is it, sometimes when you're full of rage, it actually just makes you, it actually kind of neutralizes you. It makes you unable to think strategically. So is that what's happening? And I mean, you must have had experiences with this where on the show, you have to connect with people that are so different from you. And how do you approach that? And what's the role that maybe your own views and your own frustrations and your own things that you believe in maybe aren't represented by these people, and then you have to find a way to make that relationship fruitful and empathetic. And
Yeah. You know, being on Queer Eye, if any of you haven't seen it, it's about 5 gay men that will walk into homes of individuals who generally you would assume would not be accepting of 5 gay men from different diverse backgrounds. And our job there is to connect with them, but also is to help them become their best selves. And there have been many opportunities where we are in spaces where immediately I feel triggered. And I think a lot of us in this room can experience that day in and day out just by the alerts we are constantly getting on our phone. We feel as if who I am as a woman, as a person of color, as a person of a different gender orientation, sexual orientation, or gender expression, sexual orientation, that somehow I am not of value, of somehow that I do not belong, that I am sort of on the outskirts. And we walk into spaces with that trauma.
Yeah.
And for me, when I'm on Queer Eye, the first thing I do is to check that trauma at the door. I check it at the door. I say, what is going to be my intention in this space? If I walk in with all the trauma and triggers I have, then I'm never going to be able to lean in, listen, and learn. And I think those are the main things. I lean into my fears of the labels that these individuals hold and how those labels trigger me. You know, we hear certain words that labels people put on us. And for me, I look at those and I say, okay, that label might trigger me. That label might trigger me. But I'm going to lean into that fear and ask myself, what could happen? What's the worst that could happen if I'm able to actually be open about my fear that label comes with?
I think it's one of the things I really value about the show, or it's kind of shocking, actually. I didn't realize, you know, we are, as a country, self-segregating in all kinds of ways.
Oh my gosh,
we live with people who are like us, either in the kind of jobs that they have, or the kind of beliefs that they have, or ethnically. We're all just self-segregating, and it's so unusual to see people of real difference in close quarters together. And I think that's one of the things that is so amazing about the show, is the jarring quality of having these 5 gay men march into a more traditional setting, shall we say, and just feeling how uncomfortable that is, and then feeling how quickly that dissipates.
Because at the end of the day, as you know, it's all about love. That's what we all want. We want love, we want support, we want empathy. And it's about how do we encourage somebody to grow through whatever ignorance we feel they have so that they can understand the love and the empathy that we all desire. And you do that very well in your own life. How have you noticed that your stories, your personal story and sharing it has helped people to grow through the feelings that they might have had?
I think people want to believe that they can change. I mean, I write about education. I try to write about education not just as making a living, getting a better job, but as all the ways that it changed me as a person. It made me a completely different person. And I think I hope at least, that people can identify with that journey of change. But as I was saying a minute ago, sometimes when you change, the people in your life might not accept that change, or you know, I think in the case of LGBTQ issues, it's not a change, it's who you are, and sometimes it's hard for people to accept. So I think that in that way, I hope that people are able to find value in the story. But I also tend to think, I mean, my family are very radical. They hold a lot of views that most people would find to be pretty abhorrent, actually. But I think that they're just people. And I tend to think everyone we're just people. I think we're all kind of the same. I don't actually think that there's a racist gene or a homophobic gene or a sexist gene. I think people have the beliefs they have because of the experiences that they've had.
Of course.
And I have to believe that because I've had all of those views at a point in my life. For the way I was raised, I believed some pretty shocking things. And my ideas changed because my experiences changed. And I just think everybody wants dignity. That's what people want. And they want it as whatever life they're living, in whatever way they're living it. Everybody wants that sense of respect.
Yeah, completely. You know what? I think about it now. You didn't have any form of education or experience until you were 17. So you didn't know about the Holocaust.
No.
You didn't know about the civil rights movement. How do you feel not having that information has now shaped you as an adult? Do you think that the reason that we are so divided when it comes to our stories is because people aren't educating themselves? Or do you feel like the education that people are receiving is what's helping them to be more divided?
Well, I think our education, for one thing, education is not the same thing as a school. So education is this idea, it's this abstract idea, I think, that has to do with self-discovery and with learning and discovering who you are and what the world is. But schools, again, they tend to be geographically located. They tend to be, I think certain narratives prevail. So I think sometimes, especially if we're talking about, whether we're talking about race or gender, whatever division you want to pick, I think it's not so much that people don't know the history, although that's probably part of it, but we actually know different histories. Like, we are told different stories, I think, and the way that we remember the past, if you're a part of one community, is not the same as what you remember if you're from a different community. I was raised in a state of kind of total ignorance of any of this, and I learned about the civil rights movement in college. One of my first classes, I went, and total blank slate, walked in, the professor starts talking about Rosa Parks. And I had never heard any of this, and so when he said that she was arrested for taking a seat on a bus, I thought he meant that she'd stolen.
The bus. That makes sense.
It was the only way that I could make sense. It was like a really unfortunate misunderstanding of, take a seat versus to take a seat.
Yeah.
And so I was like, how did she?
I've never thought of that.
I was like, how did she get it loose?
Yeah.
I was like, how did she? And then I was like, what did she want with it anyway? This like tiny woman, and she's gonna carry this bus seat. I was like, that's the worst crime I've ever heard. Because there was no space in my head for the idea that there would be a time in the country where you could arrest someone for sitting in a certain place. And I was just like, that she was stealing the seat made way more sense.
Yeah, completely.
Way more sense. And so he was trying to explain that, and I didn't get it at all. And then the story moved on to Emmett Till. And I think what surprises me now, as I think about the civil rights movement and what the best historians of the civil rights movement talk about, how there are certain stories that persist from that in the white community that are probably different from the ones. Like, in some ways, it's a lot more comfortable I think for most Americans to think of Rosa Parks, because it's kind of a nicer story rather than something that is so awful and so difficult, like Emmett Till. And so I kind of think I had this particular experience where I didn't know about anything, and I had my world made for me by the people I grew up with, and so in my world there was no civil rights movement. That had never been a thing. But I kind of think everyone has this to some degree. The stories that make it to us are largely curated for us by other people.
Of course.
I've talked to people who had Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I've spoken to people who had a mainstream education in this country who I've said to them about redlining, and they had no idea what I was talking about. Mm-hmm. They just had not learned that. So I think that there is something to be said for stepping outside of your comfort zone, recognizing whatever community you're a part of, people are going to curate certain stories for you that are going to represent your view of the world, and that's what's going to be put in front of you, even if you go to a school. And the trick is to step outside of that. And education should always be, I think, a little bit of a revolution, a little bit of reading things you're not quite supposed to read, that don't quite represent what the people, well-meaning, are trying to make you into. And I think for me, that was something I had to kind of grapple with. It wasn't just that I had learned a specific version of American history because I hadn't learned anything about the civil rights movement. Everybody learns a specific version of everything. Mm-hmm. And the trick is to try to get outside of that.
Well, I think you're right about that. It's perspective. And I think that's what we all need to really realize, is that this perspectives that we have, and why it's so important that we all share every part of our stories. Like, checking any part of your identity is what will stop us from growing and coming together. There's a term that some of you in here may know called code switching. Have you ever heard of that term?
No.
Yeah, y'all know about code switching. Okay, some of you do. So code switching is where you go into certain spaces, predominantly people of certain of color or people of different gender identities or expressions, sexual orientations. They'll go into a space and they'll leave certain parts of their identity and start acting a certain way in that space to feel accepted, to feel as if I belong here, or to feel like maybe now I can get this opportunity. But the problem with that is that when you leave your perspective and you leave who you are at the door, the other person no longer has an opportunity to grow. And I think that's the thing we need to realize, is that when someone doesn't have an opportunity to grow is when we become more disconnected than ever. And so to hear you talk about education in that way, it's so important because we are fed certain perspectives. People tell us one story, but we have the power to challenge that story when we show up with our full identities. When I show up and say, I'm a black man, I'm a gay man, I'm a Christian man, I'm the son of immigrant parents, I am an educated man, I am all of these things, and none of them, I'm a father. All of these things make me who I am and have informed how I walk through this world. And when I share those perspectives with someone else is when they have an opportunity to understand and empathetically listen to why their choices may hurt me. And I think that's the beauty about what our stories do for other people, is that sometimes we are scared, like you said. Education should be radical. You should read things that you would normally not read or listen to. But at the same rate, you should also talk to people and share your story with people you are nervous to talk to, with people who you perceive to be different than you.
Well, it's like what you said when you're thinking, what is the worst thing that could happen? And I think that is, as I was saying, what's so great about the show is that there's just tension when you walk into a place that is not obvious that you would be. And then in the end, it is okay. Yeah. It's always okay. And I don't know, I think education should be uncomfortable. My education was super uncomfortable in a lot of ways, and I think that is what distinguishes it from propaganda. If you're just taking, you go to a school and they tell you this is what history is, and this is what happened, and these are the stories that we care about, and these are the stories that we don't, that really is propaganda. Yeah. And it really is only when you start reading the things that are a little bit outside of that box, and it can be incredibly uncomfortable, I think. But I think you're so much better.
Education is not just formal education. I mean, exactly. You and I both have formal educations, but I think it's important for people to understand who are listening in this room and outside of this room that education comes in your everyday life. You're learning, and you have an obligation to yourself to constantly educate yourself, as you said, reaching out. And I think one of the ways that people can do that is by telling their stories, about being uncomfortable, putting themselves in spaces where they may feel uncomfortable, not unsafe, but may feel uncomfortable, so that way they can connect with other people.
Well, and everyone's story doesn't have to be your story, and your story doesn't have to be, I mean, as I said, I was raised in this extremely, let's just say, monochromatic world. And I think, the first time I started reading versions of American history that didn't represent mine, the first time I read Maya Angelou or Toni Morrison, it was jarring for me, and it didn't represent the world that I knew. And I had to kind of learn that skill to say, my experience isn't her experience, and she doesn't have to describe the world in an absolute term that I recognize. Like, this is about her experience, and it's about understanding the world that we've built for her and what it's like for her to move through that world. And it doesn't have to represent your view for you to grow and really benefit from learning how to understand that, how to appreciate it, how to listen. I think what you said at the beginning of this conversation is incredibly important. As people turn away from each other, as they stop listening, it doesn't matter necessarily if the person agrees with you on everything or if you think that they think something that is terrible. I think people are more than the worst thing about them, and if you can find that center of empathy that everybody has, I think almost everybody has that, even if they have some wrong view, that's going to be the trick. Like, that's going to be the thing. You know, when I went to Cambridge, I had a lot of appalling views about gay people. I did. I'd grown up with them. I believed what I'd been told. And I went to Cambridge and was spewing these things. And someone took an entire night and just argued with me about it and just said to me, you seem like a good person.
Yeah.
Why do you think all of these horrible things? And I sent him a really awkward email the next morning where I said, it's so nice to meet you. Thanks for arguing with me about this. I just want you to know I've thought it over, and I'm wrong, and you're right, and thank you. Because I needed to hear myself say it out loud, and I needed to hear myself say it out loud so that I could know I never want to say this again.
Yeah.
These aren't my words. They came from somebody else. Mm-hmm. I never want to say this.
Yeah.
And if someone hadn't talked to me, seen me as a human being, a complete person, and said, I don't know why you think this awful thing, but I think you're more than that, and I'm going to deal with you, I never would have changed my mind.
Well, I think that that's the perfect way to conclude this, is that understanding that connecting with other people, taking a moment to empathetically listen to them, to challenge them to grow, is what we can do to share our stories and to make sure that we find common ground. Because we are in a space where at the end of the day, like we started off, we see each other, we love each other, and we really all do want the same thing, which is love. So thank you for sharing your story. Thank you all so much for having us here today. We really appreciate it. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of this day.